All right, want to kick it over to the next slide? So welcome back to our fourth call now, all things teams and government. This week, we're going to be focusing on teams governance, which we know is top of mind for a lot of our customers as we respond to the COVID crisis. So we have two presenters today. We have Nash Fierson, who is a senior CSM, who will be talking about what teams governance is. And then we will have Jonah Levine, who is a teams technical specialist, go ahead and take us into the admin panel and give us a tour of how to set up basic governance function. And Darby, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Bridget. My name is Darby O'Brien. I am a customer success manager in state and local government, and I work with state and local agencies all across the U.S., and I'm based out of Reston, Virginia.
And I'm Bridget Ballard. I'm also a customer success manager. I'm based in the Pacific Northwest, and I am in the Bellevue, Washington home office.
With us today, we have some great guest speakers. We have Nash Fierson and Jonah Levine that are going to help us walk through this team's governance demo, and I will let them introduce themselves.
Hey, Nash Fierson. I'm a customer success manager out of Minnesota, and I get to work with people on making great business decisions that help states and local governments serve their citizens better.
Yeah, hello everybody. This is Jonah Levine. I'm a Microsoft Teams technology specialist. As you can see, covering the North Central region and helping backfill in the Southwest. But yeah, really looking forward to our session today and getting a chance to expose you to how you make these teams configurations and actually put them into production.
Awesome. All right, and Nash, I'll let you kick it off.
Okay, so Jonah and I kind of have this split where I'm going to cover the what and why, and he's going to cover the how. As our first introduction to this is to just set the stage. When we're talking about governance, we're talking about the tension that exists between different parts of an organization with different needs and wants. But when they do something, it impacts not just themselves, but other people. So this is the IT department, wanting to make things easier for them to support. This is the legal department wanting to make litigation and e-discovery easier. But most importantly, this is also the business areas that actually provide services to citizens. This is, we're talking about, social workers, public works staff, all the people out there that are trying to do the business of the organization. And Bridget, I'll let you mute people as we're going along. So that tension, that challenge there, we see organizations struggle with this all the time, right? IT has their hands on all of the knobs and controls, and the people that they talk to and that talk the loudest oftentimes can drive governance conversations. And the places that do this really, really well are the ones that make sure that the mission of the organization is what is advanced first over any particular line of business's wants or needs, especially IT, their wants and needs, and legal's wants and needs. You have to focus on the mission as a whole as we're looking at an operational risk management approach, right? Bad things can happen, but good things can happen as well too. And anytime we're trying to control against something bad, we have to look at what the impact is on the business areas of the potential good that might be prevented in that as well. We threw a couple of links in the slide deck here, and I apologize, we had to copy them in late, and so the URLs aren't looking pretty there. But there's 3 little short links for resources on adoption. And the Microsoft Service Adoption Framework is based off of 25 years of research by ProSci and about 10 years of research from McKinsey on how to do organizational changes that are focused on business outcomes first and not technical outcomes first. The first link there, that Teams adoption link, it's about a 7-minute article to read. The second link there, the adoption, actually we'll go to the third link, the adoption framework training is about 2.5 hours of training, and it's worth your time to do that adoption training. There is a 8 to 12 hour training out on edX for the adoption certification. But anyone who's going through this process of dealing with governance, this is the type of training that will help you understand how to go and do a business forward and a mission forward decision-making process. Go ahead and roll to the next slide. So as we start going down this governance path, there are a lot of fears that people worry about, things that might happen. We listed out a bunch here that I'm sure are really familiar to anybody who's already gone down this path with teams. They've already started, or maybe you dealt with it for SharePoint governance. But the big, huge problem here is that some of these fears are more imagined than real. As you go out through the service adoption framework and you look at the checklists for governance, there's a checklist for starting, and then there's a full checklist. The reason that we don't want you to go through and finish governance before you've actually started by putting things in front of end users is that you will go and make governance decisions that block highly important things to the organization in order to mitigate risks that don't actually exist. And we'll go with this first example, right, which comes from our memory of how to do SharePoint governance, right? People will create too many teams and sites, and there'll be all this confusion, and bad things will happen. If we use this as an example, though, we start asking why. We drill into the why. What are you really worried about happening? And we try to get all the way down to the root of that fear and decide whether or not that is worth controlling, right? What is the problem with too many teams and sites? Microsoft is not charging you per team. What's the problem if two people go and create their own team for the same project? Well, they'll probably have to go and talk to each other and figure out how to move those things together and who's going forward. Is that such a huge risk that we would go and put a control in place that impacts every business user? Probably not. What happens if there's two people running a team for, hey, the bike year-round to work group? Great, but is that really something we're worried about here? When we do get to something that's worrisome and worth working on, we want to make sure that we have rules in place that will help us make decisions that do the minimum amount of harm to the organization, of avoiding the good things, while still preventing the bad thing from happening, right? All of these fears that we have on this list, there is a corresponding benefit to them. So allowing end users to create teams without an encumbrance process up front and without having to ask permission means they'll experiment. They'll figure out what actually works for them. If we're worried about having too many teams, great, have an expiration policy set up. That'll get rid of the ones that aren't needed. You're worried about guest access. Well, let's talk about how we handle that with email. We're worried about people sending emails and things getting out. That's what we have things like Azure Information Protection for, data loss prevention tools, especially in state and local government. When we talk about guest access, IT doesn't spend a lot of time collaborating with outside organizations, but the rest of the business does. And we've seen great examples where IT says, well, Department XYZ will never use this tool if guest access is there because they have so much sensitive data. And then we go talk to that department, and that department's like, yeah, but we collaborate with every single county in the state, a dozen federal entities, 24 different nonprofits. We have to have a collaboration tool that works with them. It's a great example of, if the problem is certain data needs to not be shared, then great, let's only prevent certain data from being shared, not prevent guests from interacting with our environment. We can go ahead and roll on to the next slide. You see where I'm going with this. If there is a fear, let's use the best set of controls for it. But when you're setting up your governance structure, before you ever start addressing those specific fears that people bring to a governance group, you work with the governance group through that service adoption framework to understand the mission focus, and you set a couple of key concepts and key rules for how you'll make decisions going forward. This goes easier. Have these rules in place before you go and start examining specific problems that people want you to solve. I've worked with a couple of different technical specialists who've gone through this over and over again. I've worked with dozens of state and local government organizations in this process. And as I look at where we've made really good business decisions and where we've made business decisions that we've regretted later on, it comes back to about these 4 concepts here. Number one, just because we can control it doesn't mean we necessarily should. So we had the example of enabling team creation. There were people worried that bad things might happen, so they wanted to put governance and automation in front of it. So we went and built a Power App to go and guide through this process and have multiple layers of approvals. When we went back and looked at it, we hadn't actually mitigated any problems with it. All we did was put a kerchunk in the process. Just because there was a slight little bit of a business need or a worry, we put a significant burden on all of the business users, and it wasn't a compelling enough need to do that. So anytime somebody comes up with a request or some sort of a business need to put a block in place or some sort of a kerchunk in the process, make sure it's a really compelling need that outweighs the impact of positive productivity in the business areas. The second piece is people bringing up concerns about inappropriate use of things. What if someone does this or does that? And IT gets put in this trap all of the time. If you do not have an acceptable use policy, get one. If you have one, that needs to be the default answer to people problems, not technology. And it might be that the technology group needs to better surface and enable managers to enforce policies. But if we're trying to circumvent that people part with technology here, we are going to lose. And I know this is a really hard one because this can feel outside of our sphere of influence, and that's where that executive sponsorship comes in. But we don't want to take and let the potential of someone misbehaving rob every other employee from the organization of the ability to use these tools to go and fulfill the mission of the organization. Thirdly, IT's convenience cannot trump benefit to the business areas, right? We're worried about too many tickets coming in. Well, that's why you should start small and measure those things. Measure what the number of tickets and come up with the ways to go and reduce the impact on IT that perhaps don't go and block business value. We see IT organizations fall into that trap all the time, where they go and block a legitimate use case because they're worried about supporting it, and it really wouldn't have actually increased their support costs, but they didn't start and try to figure out whether or not that was actually an issue. Thirdly, we talked about this a little bit already, is you need to start. You do not need to finish. This is not a process that ever finishes. You need to have a level of governance that is good enough to get going, and then have great feedback and listening channels so that you can iterate on that governance. Anytime you do put a rule in place, you should be intentionally going and seeking out feedback from the business areas on how that either positively or negatively impacted their ability to fulfill the mission of their organization. All right, that's our kind of why and how, why and what for governance. When you do get to the places where there is a legitimate business need to put controls in place, we've got a ton of different tools that can help with that. And Jonah is going to take that away for the second half of this session.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Nash. So over the next 10 or so minutes, I'm going to quickly show you 2 slides, and then I will present a high-level demo of the Teams admin console. So out of respect for everyone's time, let's go ahead and dive in. So this first slide here is what I like to call the use what when slide. I think it does an excellent job of visualizing the relationship of Teams, Outlook, SharePoint, and OneDrive, and especially touches on how they all fit together. So I'm going to give you a really 100 level overview here, and I believe we'll be sharing this deck out after the presentation. But as you can see, kind of at the core of this illustration, you can see that OneDrive and SharePoint are listed under the content collaboration title, and that's because OneDrive is going to be your location for all of your personal file storage, whereas SharePoint is going to be more so a content management system for the broader organization. So that's really how you want to differentiate the two. You also see Microsoft Stream there. We can certainly dive really deep on Stream, but once again, at the very high level, Stream is essentially the video repository service within Office 365. You can think of it as like a commercial YouTube. Typically, you see Stream used for recording meetings and hosting them, making them available to other folks in your organization, distributing them via link, etc. They also could be used to host live streams, either within the Stream application, a Stream Live event, or a Microsoft Teams live event. So if you have more questions about that, please feel free to reach out to our team. Moving on to the left side of the illustration, you can see the inner loop is where Microsoft Teams comes into play. And I think it's really important that you think of Teams as, the tool that you're using to collaborate with folks you work with on in any given day. So that may be, some candidates for a team could be a manager and his or her direct reports. Also a project-based group. So if you're working on an initiative, adding all of those folks to one shared workspace where you can share files, communicate, create meetings, etc., or just broad communities. And so an example of that is here internally at Microsoft, we have Microsoft Teams for each of the type of roles. So for example, when I introduced myself, I had mentioned I am a Microsoft Teams technology specialist. Well, we actually have 300 or actually over 300 Teams technology specialists that work at Microsoft across a number of verticals. And so having a shared workspace where we can share best practices, ask questions, the community kind of use case for Teams is definitely one that I encourage you to utilize as well. On the right side, we have SharePoint sites. SharePoint sites, once again, really going to be used for maintaining and collaborating on content. A lot of times they can be used as internal sites, things like, utilizing, a communication site for posting, information announcements to your organization, or they can be externally facing sites. So you can actually build like an externally facing web page. And so SharePoint is a very extensible, customizable tool and can be used in many different ways. The last piece here at the bottom, Outlook, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. I like to touch on this because a lot of times when we discuss Teams, people will say, so is Teams going to replace, my use of email? The answer is absolutely not. While it will reduce the amount of emails you're sending, you're still going to be using Outlook for those targeted communications, for communicating with folks outside of your organization, whereas informal communications, like if I wanted to, send a note to Bridget and say, hey, Bridget, let's meet for lunch at noon, or hey, Bridget, do you have I have this question for you. Have you ran into this scenario before? You can replace those emails and actually just create them, as Microsoft Teams chats. So, Darby, do you mind advancing to the next slide? Thank you very much. This second slide lays out all of the primary governance controls and policies that make up a Teams governance framework. And as you can see, Teams governance is actually configured across 3 admin consoles, which is something I think a lot of times people overlook. Meaning a successful Teams governance framework is actually put in place, thinking at the broader Office 365 level. So, Nash brought up a great example. Some of the critical governance controls, like the example of creation of teams, is actually controlled at the Office 365 group level. And you can see it over here on the left third of the menu, group creation up there on the top left. So today I'm going to be focusing on the kind of the center portion of this illustration, the Teams admin console itself. But it is important to understand that, you are going to have to configure policies outside of just the Teams admin console, and hopefully I'll have enough time to show you where those consoles are. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and transition into the actual demo. So I'll share my screen out, and please let me know once you are seeing it. Everyone seeing the Teams admin console? Maybe not.
Yes.
Okay, yes. Great. Thank you. So here is the Teams admin console. And I'm going to focus on 3 key areas within this console. But I do want to mention that this is very much the tip of the iceberg. But we want to make sure we expose you to some of the key components here. So I'm going to go ahead, and as you can see on the left side, I've got a pretty comprehensive menu here of different policies and settings to configure. I'm going to go ahead and start down here in the org-wide settings area, because there's a couple key components here that I want to touch on. We'll begin with external access, and a lot of times people are confused between, what is external access versus guest access. I saw let anonymous users join elsewhere in the admin console. What are all of these things? What is the difference? And to be honest, the taxonomy can be a little bit confusing. So I want to make sure that I just put this to rest right now. External access is essentially federation in Teams. So meaning it's the ability to call, to chat, and set up meetings with external users. So let's use an example. If you're working with a vendor or anyone in another organization for that matter, and you need to be able to chat with those users, then you're going to want to enable external access, as you can see here. So we've enabled users to communicate with other Skype for Business and Team users and users to communicate with Skype users. As you can see, you also have the ability to limit by domain. Currently, I have not limited the domain. And with that, with this configuration, you're allowing your users to communicate with any domain externally, any Skype for Business or Teams domain, let me clarify. However, once you start going in and adding domains, and let's say I come in here and I add Contoso, .contoso.com as the domain, once you add an initial either block or add, it's going to become exclusive to that list. So if you say, I want to add the domain and we're going to allow only users to communicate externally with folks at Contoso Corp, once you do that, you're limiting their external communication strictly to Contoso Corp. So that's an important component to understand. Moving on down the menu here into guest access. So remember, external access is federation. Guest access is actually referring to letting users outside your organization join your teams, come in, be a part of your team, your shared workspace, jump into your different channels. And so it's a lot broader than just communicating externally, which is what external access does. So guest access actually allows you to collaborate within your workspaces. So if you're going to be bringing in vendors, if you're going to be bringing in your Microsoft account team, and you want the ability to bring them in and share documents with them, have a team dedicated to asking questions to that vendor, to the Microsoft team, you're going to want to make sure that you allow guest access within your teams. As you can see, once you choose to turn that on, you'll be given a couple other permissions that you choose from here. So do you want these guest users to be able to make private calls? Do you want them to be able to turn on IP video during meetings, or generate an ad hoc meet now meeting, among other tools here, among other features, excuse me. So things like, do you want them to be able to edit messages that they've sent? And once again, we're referring to these guest users here. Deleting messages. Do you want them to be able to chat at all? Utilize the GIFs, memes, stickers, all the fun stuff. So, once you turn Teams on, guest access within Teams on, you really do want to start thinking about all of these other controls as well. Do you want to be very careful about not letting guest users communicate with other guest users? Then you may want to go ahead and turn off allow meet now. Or if you don't want them to be able to delete their sent messages or chat whatsoever, those are kind of that's the due diligence that you're going to want to do, when you're thinking about whether or not you want to allow guest users within Teams.
Residents.
So I think we're getting a little bit of feedback. Just want to make sure, is that myself or does someone else have their mic unmuted?
It takes you to the department form.
So Bridget, if you don't mind going ahead and muting whoever that is, I want to just keep on chugging along here.
Go ahead.
So the next area I wanted to jump into was the messaging policies. So as you'd imagine, this refers to controlling what messaging features are available to your users. And as you can see, we have a global policy here that will be applicable, across all of our users. But you could also create additional policies by clicking this add button here. And, for example, let's call this, HR messaging policy. And then you can create a messaging policy that just applies to a specific user or even user group. Within messaging policies, I think it's very important that we just very quickly walk through each of these options. Similar to what we saw when we were looking at guest access, do you want owners to be able to delete messages that they sent? And if you notice, there's also delete sent messages. So these two are actually two different configurations. Owners can delete sent messages is different than being able to delete any sent message within a team. So that's the differentiation between the two there. Editing sent messages, we talked about that. Read receipts would be, similar to what you're seeing on SMS. Do you want to get feedback when someone has acknowledged or seen your, seen the chat that you sent over? All of the fun stuff, the GIFs, the memes, the stickers. I recommend always allowing, translation, immersive reader, some of the accessibility features. And as well as being able to do things like sending urgent messages using priority notifications. One thing I do want to mention is some of these features, you'll notice that there are, there are switches for you to turn them on, but they're not actually available in government today. I don't believe urgent messages are available in government, but Nash, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But a lot of times you will see that this feature is not, available, but the switch is available here in the admin console. And so what I'd recommend you do is just go ahead and turn that off. Because if it is on, the day that it becomes available in GCC and rolled out to your tenant, your users will start being able to take advantage of that feature. And so I'm really quickly, I know I'm really kind of force feeding a lot of information here, but just one more important area is I also wanted to jump into the meeting policies over here. Same messaging policy, but focusing on the Teams meeting features. So we will focus here on the global policy that we have set. Choosing whether or not you want to allow users to meet now in channel or something allowing transcription. I always, my recommendation is if it's an accessibility feature, I always recommend turning it on. However, something like allowing cloud recording, that's a pretty sensitive topic. And do you want users at the global level to be able to record meetings? You're really going to want to think about all the different types of users. For example, maybe there are folks in HR who you don't want to be able to record sensitive meetings that have, financial information. And so, you really do want to think about each of these, configurations prior to, making them live in your tenant. There's a number of other topics that we can touch here, but I know we only have 3 minutes. One key one that I want to touch on is here, let anonymous people start a meeting. So basically what this is going to be, if you're familiar with the Skype, lobby experience, if you want anonymous users to be able to jump in and immediately, spin up a meeting, you would turn this on. If you leave it off, and you can see, there are little policy kind of tips here. If you turn it off, they will not, users who have not been authenticated will not be able to go ahead and be the individual who starts a meeting. You also have some lobby bypass options. So things like, whether or not you want dial-in users to automatically bypass the lobby, or if you want them to be admitted. These settings kind of tie in hand over here. With that being said, I do want to transition over to the Q&A portion, but before I do, I just want to mention, this was, a lot in a very short period of time. And like I mentioned earlier, very much so the tip of the iceberg. So more than happy to dive deeper with your accounts, and I'm sure your Microsoft account teams would have a resource who are more than willing to kind of walk you through your admin console. But in the last 2 minutes, Bridget, do you want to open up to Q&A? How exactly do you typically go about that? Are there questions in the conversation tab?
I think our Microsoft team has done a great job answering the questions in the chat. If anybody has questions that they'd like to ask off mute, feel free, or post your questions in the chat. And I know we're running we might run a little bit over, but we can answer some of those right now, or we can follow up with them after as well.
And so one other thing I want to mention, and Bridget, please correct me if I'm wrong, are they going to be receiving this collateral, the PowerPoint deck?
Yes, we'll post the PowerPoint deck.
Great. So all of these different topics here within the Teams governance resource guide that I sent you, there's actually a correlating official Microsoft documentation for each and every single one of these topics. So if you just go to Bing and specifically Bing and type in retention policies Microsoft Docs, and let's go ahead and show you that in real time here. You can find the official guidance that Microsoft has. And so I do recommend, as you're going through each of those different, and I apologize, I just jumped out of the PowerPoint there. As you're thinking about each of these different components, please do look at the official documentation. And then as you have additional questions, of course, always turn to your Microsoft team who will happily support you. I do see we've just eclipsed our 1:30 end time, so I do want to thank everyone for your time. I'm willing willing and able to stick around a little longer. So if there's any questions, whether that people want to unmute themselves or just continue typing them in here on the side, I'm more than happy to stick around for those. But yeah, thank you everybody, and Bridget, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you and Darby.
Thank you, Nash and Jonah. That was excellent. And thank you for offering to stick around. So we'll keep the call up for just the next 5 to 10 minutes. And if anyone has any specific questions about governance in their environment or some best practices, please feel free to ask now. And we'll also be sure to post kind of a Q&A document on the questions that were asked in our point drive at the end of this.
Yeah, so if you don't have any questions, feel free to jump off, but the 4 of us will stick around for a few minutes.
I will also post the link to our point drive in the chat now, which will have all of our past recordings, as well as this one, hopefully by end of day. And some of the past ones we've done are Teams 101, as well as Teams on the mobile app. And last month we did third-party app integration and how to enable it.
Great. So if seems like we do not have any additional questions, I'm going to go ahead and jump off. But yeah, thank you everybody. Both Bridget and Darby for putting this together. Nash, appreciate you helping me out. And it was a pleasure. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions.